What's up, guys? It's TheDuckChris back with another Ramble, and today we're going to talk about one of the coolest weapons in old school. That's right, the Abyssal Bludgeon. So I want to talk about the Bludgeon because I think the Bludgeon has been designed in a way that is very unique, interesting, and well balanced. And I think more weapons should be designed like the Bludgeon. And basically what I'm talking about is the fact that it comes in 3 parts from a single boss. People want generous drop rates from a boss. This has been shown, Nightmare has very expensive items, they're very valuable, but people have been getting very frustrated here and there by going extremely dry, spending many hours to get an item, even if the overall GP per hour works out, it'll take many hours to reach that rate, and so it does get frustrating over time. Same thing goes with something like Chambers. Over time your GP per hour is very high, but a lot of that depends on getting a twisted bow, and it can be thousands of hours before you get one. So a lot of people just never reach that rate, and so the actual GP per hour they get at Chambers can be a lot lower. And that's with other items on the drop rate too that are very good. So it's not necessarily just a matter of giving you a lot of drops that you can get, giving you common drops that give you a good consistent loot. You want to be able to get the big items, and you want to be able to get them in a reasonable amount of time. But you know what people also want is items that are useful and expensive. There's a decent drop rate at plenty of bosses that just don't hold a ton of value at those items. For example, Smoke Devils. You have one of the best items in the game in terms of single item damage bonus versus its second best in slot in the Occult Necklace, being worth less than a mil because it comes so commonly that it's just too easy to get. You're not going to get a lot of value for one selling it to the wider market because there's just so many coming in. Another example, so let's talk about generous drop rates. Generous drop rates is a great way to make content feel rewarding, and in the game we have a bunch of different bosses with generous drop rates that is pretty common uniques. And let's take a look at how that works. So one example is Zulrah. We have a 1 in 128 for the items for any drop. Of course, one of those is an Onyx, so it's not really a unique, but overall 3 out of the 4 are unique items that come from Zulrah, and they still hold a good amount of value today. Well, why is that if there's so many coming in? But that's of course the sync. You can disassemble them for Zulrah scales. So this actually wasn't in the game at the beginning, if I remember correctly, and it was only when the uniques really started to drop in price that Jagex implemented the disassembling function, and that's pretty much kept the value of the uniques tied to the value of Zulrah scales from then on, so that it's basically a floor, like it can't go lower. But it really hasn't gone much higher than that. Even the blowpipe, when it was there was a period of a couple years where the blowpipe was significantly above the scale price for the amount of scales you would get from it, but it would never be above more than I think 6 mil, 7 mil maybe was the peak it was at. So even with an item sync, when you have generous drop rates, the items are not going to retain a ton of value. Another example of a boss with generous drop rates is Cerberus. So if you've done Cerberus before, you know that it's a 1 in 128, again similar to Zulrah for the crystals, and you can get a lot of kills per hour. Obviously there's some requirements to help you get to Cerberus, so it's not like everyone can get this, but once you do get there, you have a good chance of getting a crystal, pretty much 1 per task on average at least. And how does that keep the value up? Well, they're a partial item. So some of them are, the boot crystals, they're only part of the drop. So you have, the dragon boots, infinity boots, and ranger boots add on to them. And you also have the smoldering stone, which has a sink to make infernal items, but also, is only part of the item. So you could do that, where you have a generous drop rate, but you're not getting the full item from that boss. So to combine that with another item would keep the value of both items up at least a little bit. Another example similar to that is Zamorak, where they have the Zamarakian Hasta, and while that comes in a lot, you need it to make the lance, so it keeps its value up. Another example of good drop rates with value or items that are still in demand is raids, Chambers of Xeric, as we were talking about before. And how did those keep value? Well, there's a large drop table. You have an overall pretty good chance of getting a unique, but it might not be the one unique you're looking for. So overall, the drop rate of each individual item is low, but you still get rewarded because you get the drops pretty often. And that is good for a while, but over time it adds up, and now, as we're seeing, the prayer scrolls really dropping in value because they just come in so often, and of course are the most common unique from raids. So those are 3 ways that we currently have generous drop rates in game. But as I said, the other thing people want is expensive, useful items. So an example of it, the most expensive, most useful items we have is the Scythe and the T-Bow. And the way that it comes in right now is a single drop, and it's a very rare drop. It takes some people, as I said, over 1,000 hours to get. On average, it's at least 300 hours, I think. I'm not sure exactly these days with kill per hour and, specific drop rates for various team sizes. But it can be a long time. It can be a long time to get these items, and especially like if you're an Iron Man, for example, it's one of those peak account goals that may take you forever. Your average player is definitely not ever guaranteed to get this drop. It could just never happen. And so in terms of having an item that makes that content really good, this can be disappointing. Now, I think there's something to be said for having an item that you may never get, but if you do get, just makes all that time worthwhile. It's very exciting. Like when you're hoping to get a T-Bow, there's a good chance you're not going to get it, but that doesn't mean that you don't want to try for it. Because if you do get it, it's like just so exciting. Oh my gosh, you just got the biggest item in the game. And, it's always going to keep that high value. But what if you could get the T-Bow 3 times as often? It would be 3 times less interesting in terms of price, but over time you would get about the same amount. And that I'm not let's make it clear. This wouldn't mean that you get a T-Bow every day or every week or every month. It just means in terms of, getting it every 300 to 1,000 raids, in teams, let's say, you get it every 1 to 300 raids in teams. And it's only worth 1/3 of the price, but it's still very exciting. So this could be, so this is basically how the bludgeon works. The bludgeon comes as the main drop from Sire. The Sire has 2 unique drops, not counting the jar and the pet, which is pretty much tertiary. The bludgeon, or the Sire, was released with 2 unique drops, being the dagger and the bludgeon. And the bludgeon was more useful because it was a single item, it was crush, and as we've discussed in other rambles, crush is a more useful style over stab. It was good against gargoyles, it was just overall a great weapon. And when it came out, for a long time it held a lot of value, and it still is, the best drop from Sire, and Sire is a pretty decent weapon, or a pretty decent boss for GP per hour because of that. But the drop rates at this boss are also pretty generous. So compared to Cerberus, which of course is faster, but is a similar kind of boss, a Slayer boss, Sire is actually even better drop rates. An Unsired comes only 1 in 100, and so if you have a task of 150 to even 250 with extensions, I have to blast him. You're gonna get an Unsired pretty much every task on average. So this is kind of the design case that I think people are going to really respond to positively. You have an item that carries a lot of value, but you also have the ability to get that item more often than you would at somewhere like Nightmare or one of these places with a high drop rate. And how do they do this? By having it in parts. So the way that Sire works is the way that I think other drops of this kind can work, where you get a random piece to start with, and then from then on, you get them in order. Or maybe not necessarily in order, but you just don't get duplicates. And this could happen easily. Take the Scythe, for example. The Scythe is currently a 1 in, I think, 19.1 times 10-ish. So about a 1 in 200 from TOB. But what if instead there were 3 items and they were a 1 in 65? And those items were a Scythe blade, a Scythe chain, and a Scythe handle. And they were all tradable. This is something that the Bludgeon doesn't do currently, but it easily could do, is just have all 3 pieces be tradable. They would hold about a third of the value of the full item, pretty much exactly. They may fluctuate a bit, but ultimately they're all going to be about the same because it's random whichever one you get first. And then you can assemble them all to make the Scythe. So this is like, ultimately it's just going to be more consistent to get the weapon. It's going to be more consistent money. And it's going to, keep the value about the same, because the overall rarity of making the weapon is about the same. Now, this may or may not affect, how many scythes are in the game, just in terms of how much people are willing to do the content. When you do TOB and you get a scythe on your first KC, in this system that wouldn't happen. You would get a scythe on, you would have to roll the scythe 3 times to get the full weapon. But this overall, if you look at the economy, like 3 people can get a scythe on the first KC, but also 3 people can get a scythe piece on the first KC. And because it happens 3 times as often, you would have the same chance of 3 people getting a full scythe as you would of 9 people getting a scythe piece. So overall, you'd have the same amount of items coming into the game. Now, why is this good? It seems very complicated. It makes items less value. Like, what's the point? So the point is this. If you're doing Nex, and Nex is a group boss, so you want to have something that you can split between you and your friends. You don't want to give Nex so many items that it's impossible to complete. This is a problem that happened with Nightmare. If you're an Iron Man doing Nightmare, 1 in 100 for a drop rate is not too bad. It's a lot of hours in terms of the time it takes, but ultimately it's doable to get 1 item. But the fact is, with such a big drop table, Nightmare has 3 orbs, 3 armor pieces, the staff, and the mace. That's 8 items. The chances of getting all those 8 in order are basically nothing. And so you're going to get duplicates. And the power of the system of breaking it into 3 is the function of not getting duplicate items. So ultimately what this does is it lets you get the expensive items more often without making it impossible to complete the items. And at the same time, it makes the boss, you know, able to give valuable rewards without having such a huge drop table full of various things. And as we can have determined, like when talking about new bosses and new content that we want coming up with a ton of new rewards to fill up a drop table is honestly just a really taxing chore. Like, you don't want to have 10 different items coming from one boss, or the next time you want to put a boss in the game, excuse me, you'll have to come up with 10 more items. So, you know, if you just had one item that was coming from that boss, or two, like, you know, like Sire, Cerberus even has 4 items, but, you know, not 10. God Wars also, like, has a couple items. You know, these bosses, they only have a few items, but they're still rewarding because the drop rates are pretty generous. So overall, I think that, you know, this is something that could be considered for the new boss, for next, for group bosses, and even for raids. It's hard to fill up a drop table with a ton of different items. Obviously, raids in the past have had that one item that is extremely rare, and I think that maybe that is a good thing to continue. But for something like Nex, which in the past, in its previous incarnation, had very generous drop rates and just a huge table, I think it would be worthwhile to split up, you know, maybe the most popular item from Nex, if it's a weapon, into several pieces. Even if it's, you know, an armor fragment or something that you have to assemble, then that would work too. So that's kind of my idea. Split up the bludgeon into 3 pieces, and it's a very good content. Split up the scythe into 3 pieces. Would it work? Who knows? Let me know what you think in the comments. That's it for this ramble. I think I'm going to do another one maybe later this week. Designing my own next drop table from scratch. So look for that one. And if you made it this far in the video, leave a like, subscribe, and maybe hit me up on Twitter if you want. And until next time, peace.